From the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University speaking here today on Medscape Cardiology in the Heart.org. Over the last several years, I've had the opportunity to talk with not just researchers in the field of cardiovascular medicine and science, but authors who happen to be cardiologists or the corollary cardiologists who happen to be authors. And I've had a great deal of fun talking to these colleagues to really explore why it is that they have chosen to write. And sometimes it's fiction, sometimes it's nonfiction. And how do they feel that that contributes to the discourse in the medical literature, how they feel that reaching largely a lay audience contributes to cardiovascular science and knowledge. So I'm really pleased today to be joined by Dr. Sandeep Juahar, who is the author of Intern and Doctored, two books that I previously had an opportunity to discuss. And we're here today to talk about his latest book called Heart, A History. Sandeep, thanks for joining us here on Medscape Cardiology.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
I had the opportunity over the last week or so to read the book, and first I'll say unabashedly that I enjoyed it greatly. I learned a fair bit about the history of how one thinks about the heart, and I really enjoyed the way that you wove history, physiology, science, and your own personal history. So well done. It makes for a very compelling read.
Thank you so much.
Let's start broad, and then we'll go into some specifics. Why do you write? And I should point out that in addition to writing books, you also are now a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. So a fair bit of your professional activity is actually devoted to writing. So why do you do it? I mean, you sound busy enough as a transplant cardiologist on Long Island.
I've always enjoyed writing from when I was in school, just a school child. I started writing in this latest phase of my career, sort of around the time I started my internship. And I really wrote about things that I was puzzled by. Internship is a great time to start writing because everything is new and in many ways puzzling. There are a lot of sort of physical stresses, but also moral stresses that come up. Should we really be doing this to this particular patient? Why is the treatment plan this way? I would think about these things, and it really helped me to put down my thoughts on paper, to really try to figure out what I thought about or what I believed. And that impetus has continued into my professional years as a doctor.
It's interesting for me to hear what you say. I also write, but in a very different venue. I write in the scientific literature. So when I am troubled by how we care for a particular disease or a particular type of patient, I'm always trying to figure out, well, how could we study this and what might we do? But you've taken a different approach, as have some of your, I'll say, physician colleagues who are authors. Why do you think you and I go down different paths? Is it just that our brains work differently or that we're expressing ourselves differently?
It might be. The first question I usually ask myself is, what do I think about this? How does this fit with my previous experience? I tend to be very introspective when I'm posed with some sort of challenge or conflict in my professional life, whether it's a moral challenge or an ethical conundrum or something that just bothers me. And so I think they're equally valid approaches. And I highly admire the physician scientists like you who can increase the breadth of our knowledge about things. I think they're complementary roles and both have equal importance.
When I'm writing, Sandeep, I'm thinking about my clinical and scientific colleagues mostly. When you write, I sense that you're thinking much broader than me. You're thinking about the public, you're thinking about patients, and you're thinking about the medical community. Is that a fair thing for me to say?
Yeah, I've written perspectives in the New England journals that are primarily directed toward my professional colleagues. I've written pieces in the New York Times that really goes out to a much broader audience. But in both types of writing, And I suspect somewhat in what you do as well, we're trying to get a point across. We're trying to persuade, and we're trying to teach. And that's what really gives me a sense of purpose in this sphere of my life, is trying to get my ideas across and teach new concepts to the public. I think it's really important to improve health literacy in this country. I think there's ample evidence that if patients were more educated about what was going on in their treatment plans, that we would have probably less unnecessary testing and everyone would be better off. So I think this kind of approach has a very broad purpose and can really improve things for both patients and their caregivers.
One of the things that I think leads naturally into our discussion about your latest book called Heart, A History, because I sense that what you are trying to do in the book, and certainly correct me, but one of the things I took away from it was that you are trying to increase heart health literacy, and that you're doing it in a way that I think is appealing both to the public as well as to somebody with a scientific background. You simplify cardiac physiology and cardiac biology, but I would not say that you dumb it down, not at all. You actually present some pretty complicated concepts, but you've talked about it in a way that I think is very approachable. And as I said, wrapping it around the history of the time, whether we're talking about the Renaissance period of dissection or we're talking about the mid-part of the 1900s of trying to solve the problem of the heart-lung machine, wrapping the physiology around the medical history, I thought was a brilliant way to convey these concepts, and then bringing out your own family history and adding the narrative to that. Very powerful. So talk about the book. Your previous two books, at least to me, were very, very different than this one.
I'd say probably the primary impetus for the book was my malignant family history. I grew up in a home where my father was still mourning the death of his own father of a sudden heart attack decades after he had died. My grandfather, my father's father, died suddenly while he was having lunch with my father, who was not yet 14 years old.
Why don't you tell our listeners the story, because I think it's a powerful narrative. It certainly grabbed me.
My grandfather had been working in a shop, and that morning he went to the shop and he was moving some sacks of grain, and he was bitten by something. He wasn't sure exactly what it was. They thought it was a snake, but snakebite was very common in those parts of India back then, and so he didn't really pay it much mind, came home for lunch, and while he was having lunch, his neighbors, being the good neighbors that they were, brought in a dead cobra and claimed this was the snake that had bitten my grandfather. He took one look at it and went pale and said, "How can I survive this?" And within minutes, he had slumped to the floor and went unconscious. The family summoned an ambulance, and they took my grandfather, who had died probably a couple of hours after this had happened. They took him to the hospital and the snake. And the doctor there said that my family thought that he had died of the snake bite, but the doctor said no, this was a heart attack. A snake bite would not have killed him so suddenly. My father, like many who have witnessed the sudden death of a loved one, never got over it. Throughout my childhood, there were moments where the emotion just came out of him. And so I, by extension, also sort of became a little obsessed with the heart. You know, the heart as the executioner of men in the prime of their lives. There was this fear factor. With most diseases, there's a prelude. But with the heart, you can die suddenly. You can die even if you're healthy. To me, as a child, that just seemed like the biggest cheat in the world, that my father, who's walking around healthy, doing his job, loving his children, he could just die. That's really what drove my obsession with the heart. I wrote about this in the book. I used to lie in bed and stare up the ceiling fan and sort of time my heartbeat with the revolution of the fan's blade. I was just fascinated by this organ that was so powerful that it beat 3 billion times in a typical human lifetime. A typical adult heart can empty a swimming pool in a week, and yet it could stop. suddenly, and that it was so strong yet so vulnerable, and by extension, it rendered us vulnerable because everything depended on the circulation of the blood from the heart. And so that was primarily what drove, what sort of inspired me to go into cardiology. And I'll say one more thing. The other aspect that really I learned, actually, that was a driver of this book, but I really only came to appreciate it as I started to research the book, is that the history of heart discovery is absolutely fascinating. There are so many wonderful, amazing stories of self-experimentation, and most people don't realize that the heart had never been operated on until the late 19th century. Every other organ had been operated on. And the reason is pretty clear. The heart is always moving, and it's filled with blood. So it's very hard to cut into something that's moving, and if you cut it open, you would bleed to death. So that was an almost insurmountable technical challenge, and I talk about in the book about how that challenge was circumvented. It's just a fascinating story.
Many of the stories I had at least I'll call it a passing familiarity with, and as we got into the more recent stories of, for example, the history of cardiac cath, I did know many of those stories, but there are people along the way who became obsessed with trying to understand the way that the heart worked or the way that the heart might be manipulated. And then there are people who sort of fell into it. And one of the first examples of the African-American surgeon who was faced with a patient who had I think it was a knife wound to the chest, and was bold enough to open up and to actually do an operation. I mean, extraordinary stuff.
No one had operated on the heart, in part because of what I mentioned. The heart is always moving and it's filled with blood. And so that makes it exceedingly difficult to manipulate surgically. But also there were cultural prohibitions to manipulating the heart. The heart was, throughout history, considered the locus of our emotions, our souls. And so I think those cultural prohibitions did as much to retard progress as the scientific obstacles. But you're right, Daniel Hill Williams is a very inspiring story, an African-American surgeon who grew up in poverty. Eventually, he apprenticed with a barber as a shoe repair man, and eventually became educated in medicine, and in 1893 was faced with an extraordinary challenge. A man had been stabbed in a scuffle in a bar and was bleeding, and Daniel Hill Williams opened up the chest, saw that the pericardium was ripped open, and he stitched it closed. As with most things, it's sort of hard to know exactly how the history. There's some evidence that a St. Louis surgeon had done something similar a couple of years earlier, but he hadn't published his work, and Williams almost certainly didn't know about it. But in any case, Williams put a couple of stitches in, closed the pericardium, and that is still considered the first pericardial surgery. It's really fascinating stuff. And the fact that an African-American doctor who was educated during Reconstruction and was living in the Jim Crow era, the fact that he was the first to do it is really amazing.
It's one of the, what I'll call the extraordinary characters who have become fascinated by the heart, its function, and trying to think about ways to manipulate it for the benefit of human health. And I think about the stories that you told of the development of the heart-lung machine. There was a group of extraordinary characters, if you will, who embarked upon that. And then the whole cast of characters who were involved with the development of coronary angiography and then ultimately coronary angioplasty, Charlie Dotter and Mason Sones and Andreas Grunzig. This was, excuse the pun, but not for the faint of heart.
No, not at all. The heart-lung machine was first conceived really by Gibbon in the late 1920s. It wasn't built, as you probably know, until the early 1950s. And there were a lot of things going on. There was the Depression, there was World War II, and there were these cultural prohibitions that I think slowed things down. So in the absence of a heart-lung machine, what one of the most innovative American surgeons, Walt Lillehei, did was he said when a pregnant mother is carrying a fetus, she's exchanging blood with her fetus. She's providing oxygen and clearing out waste. Why can't I hook up a child to a parent with the same blood type, artery to artery, vein to vein, and have the parent serve as a human heart-lung machine? And he did these surgeries. He was really the only person in the world doing open heart surgery in the early 1950s before the heart-lung machine came into widespread use. It's almost mind-boggling that people at the time really responded very fiercely to Lillehei's suggestion. He ultimately did the experiments, but they said this is the first surgery in human history that could kill 2 people. Like with Forsman and some of the other pioneers, he stood his ground, and he had to have just incredible fortitude to plow ahead.
Well, it really raises the issues of how we innovate as a field, how we develop new technology. It takes a boldness, it takes a creativity. You forget one of the great triumphs of modern cardiovascular medicine is the repair of congenital heart defects, and you forget how life-altering being able to operate on the heart for these congenital defects was. And that now, as you know well, we have a whole specialty now of adult congenital heart disease that was not a specialty we needed 20 years ago.
That's right. Congenital heart disease was a major killer of children in the 1940s and 50s. And what Lillehei and Gibbon and some of these pioneers were able to do saved just innumerable lives. It's really something to be admired and be grateful for.
Well, let me, as we get near the end here, ask your thoughts on a couple of things. First, where's cardiovascular medicine going? You marched us through the technology, you marched us through the drugs which changed people's lives, and you point out that, look, many of our drugs have now been used for decades. We've had great success. Many of our technologies and our surgeries and our procedures have evolved to the point where they're increasingly, in some ways, common and straightforward. You end the book talking a lot about prevention. Is this what you see needs to be the major impetus of investigation going forward?
I think one of them. Cardiovascular medicine is one of the great success stories of medicine broadly in the 20th century. Some people don't know that roughly 1 out of 2 Americans was dying of cardiovascular disease in the 1940s, after World War II. There's been a tremendous decrease in mortality for a number of reasons. In part, it was because of public health advances, promoting smoking cessation, statins, ameliorating cardiovascular risk factors. In part, it was the technologies that I've mentioned, coronary angiography and bypass surgery. But whatever it is, the decline has been very awe-inspiring. But that rate of decline has slowed in the last 10 or 15 years. So I think to maintain the kinds of progress that we've gotten used to, we're going to have to look at different things. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the emotional heart, how we cope with emotional distress, is exceedingly important in how and whether we develop heart disease. And this is an area that remains relatively unexplored. The American Heart Association still doesn't list emotional stress as a key modifiable risk factor for heart disease. There's a long history behind that. Framingham investigators deliberately avoided looking at psychosocial factors because of various reasons that I explore in the book. But it's also just much easier to lower your blood pressure by taking a pill than it is to lower your emotional stress. And I think that also in part informs the decision by our large organizations not to really face this issue head on. But I do think that it needs to be addressed because that, to me, is a relatively unexplored frontier.
And the other area that the Heart Association has been very involved in that you address in the book is we're also, as a profession, going to be moving more and more towards, I would say, the large-scale policy issues around things that are the social determinants of health and wellness, including cardiovascular health, which includes, and you mentioned this, things like having access to sidewalks and being able to exercise, and the tobacco issues from a policy perspective. Poverty issues obviously weigh heavily in cardiovascular disease, and I was pleased to see that you begin near the end of the book to bring that out.
Yes. When we think about stress in cardiovascular disease, one of the things that really is very obvious is sort of acute emotional stress resulting in like a Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, for example. That is stress that's just exploding. But there's also chronic stress, chronic occupational stress, or marital stress that can promote coronary disease and heart disease. Those are things that we also need to address.
So speaking of that, what are you going to do next? I imagine that the emotional toll of writing a book of this magnitude is such that you need to take a break a bit, but is there something you can tell our listeners is next up for you?
I will definitely let you know once I figure it out. I'm taking an extended break, I think. I very much enjoy writing, and I very much appreciate the response I've gotten from readers to this book, and it inspires me to continue writing. We'll see what's up next, but I haven't quite figured that out.
There are many of us that enjoy your writing, so we'll look forward to seeing what you are going to reflect upon and share with us, whether it's in the New York Times, in your role as a contributing opinion writer, or if it's as a book author. We look forward to it. I want to thank you, Sandeep, for joining me today. My guest has been Sandeep Juahar, who's an associate professor at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. He's an advanced heart failure transplant cardiologist, and as we've been discussing, an accomplished author. And Sandeep, thank you for joining us on Medscape Cardiology. I enjoyed your book, and even more so, I enjoyed talking with you about it.
Thank you, Bob. It's always a pleasure.